Time to elevate. You're running on empty with Matt and Tony.
Hey, welcome everybody. We are running on empty. My name is Matt.
And I'm Tony.
And we are running on empty. And we have a really fun show planned for today for the Thanksgiving holiday. And it's going to really revolve a lot around Thanksgiving and what our understanding of it is. And hopefully by the end of this interview, a new understanding of what it is and probably the correct understanding of what it is.
Yeah, Matt, I think this is going to be a real fun show. We have with us a real professional historian who can maybe help us understand what some of the facts are of Thanksgiving, maybe what is some of the fiction, maybe what is some of the contested territory in the story.
Sure.
And he is Dr. Gabriel Loiacono. He is an associate professor of history at UW Oshkosh. He earned his bachelor's degree in American history from UC Berkeley and his doctorate in American history from Brandeis University. He's got a book that will be coming out in 2021 with Oxford University Press, which will explain how welfare worked in George Washington's time.
Wow.
Through the lives of 5 people who either received welfare or doled it out. We'll talk a little bit about that near the end of our interview today. Dr. Loiacono's teaching covers early America, and he enjoys exploring what the sources tell us about the first Thanksgiving along with students. Thank you so much for being here, Gabe. We appreciate it.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. It's a topic that I think we all think about, and so it's good to hash it out and figure out what we know and what we don't know.
Yeah, and I thought it might be a good idea for Matt and I to start with what did we learn as kids about Thanksgiving? So here's what I learned. I'm from New York City originally. So I was taught, of course, that the Native Americans sold Manhattan Island for $24 in trinkets. And then along with that, when it came to Thanksgiving, I was taught that these brave people called the Pilgrims were in search of religious freedom, and that they left Europe and they settled at Plymouth Rock, and they struggled against some pretty harsh elements, starvation, disease, and that the native population, out of the goodness of their heart, helped the Pilgrims, and thus they had this celebratory feast, and that became Thanksgiving. That was the story I was taught, and I distinctly remember it in grade school and middle school. Matt, what story were you taught about Thanksgiving?
That exact same story. And I was, as you were saying this, I'm remembering the picture books and, how, the 3 ships, kind of nicely docked and, they explored a little bit, but they were wanting to, kind of get away from persecution and everything because they wanted their religious freedom. And then they came across the Native Americans, and there was all these great picture books where everybody got along, and they were all, had all these, these bountiful harvests and food. And I'm like, okay, well, this is a really nice, this is cool. I'm guessing that's partially true, but I can't believe we're not being told everything. At least what we learned in grade school. And that's, back in the, late 60s, early 70s. So.
Yeah. So Gabe, tell us what is the more accurate story?
Yeah, well, there's a long answer to that question, but I guess I would start by saying that your stories are generally true. But I think as Matt said, that's not everything, right? There are some important parts that are missing. But it is certainly true that these English people were fleeing religious persecution in England. And it is true that there was a meal shared between English people and Wampanoag people in September of 1621. The tricky part is that no one at the time called that a Thanksgiving. So the moniker of Thanksgiving was attached to that meal about 2 centuries later in the mid 19th century.
Was that by Abraham Lincoln?
It was not by him, although Lincoln is the first president to kind of regularly call this celebration in November. of each year. But people, especially English descended people in New England, were really getting interested in this old history of the early colonization period in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, and they're the ones that started to attach this name of Thanksgiving to that event in 1621.
Mm-hmm. But what about the idea? And every year now there are articles that come out that say that this Thanksgiving story is really designed to kind of be some kind of ruse to hide the true story of colonial violence. I mean, just yesterday in the USA Today, there was a story that was headlined, "After a Summer of Racial Reckoning, Is America Ready to Learn the Truth About Thanksgiving?" And they do quote one historian, maybe you've heard of him, David Silberman, who's got a book coming out called "This Land is Their Land, the Wampanoag Indians, Plymouth Colony, and the Troubled History of Thanksgiving." And he says, apparently, as Americans looked for an origin story that wasn't soaked in the blood of Native Americans or built on the backs of slavery, the humble, bloodless story of the 102 pilgrims forging a path in the New World in search of religious freedom was just what they needed. So what do you, and I don't think Dr. Silberman is alone in framing Thanksgiving this way now. So what do you think about that story?
Yeah, I would highly recommend that book, although I say that without having yet read it. It is on my list. But I've read other things by David Silverman. And I think what's really important about what he's doing is he's framing that story, going back to what Matt said, in a much larger context, and talking about some of the backstory before 1621, which included some more violent encounters between especially English sailors and Wampanoag people, and then also taking that story beyond 1621, because the probably the saddest part of the diplomatic relationship between English people and Wampanoag people is King Philip's War of 1675. So while it's definitely true that there's a peace treaty between the Wampanoag people and the English people in 1621, that alliance is really strained over the next 50 years and breaks down into one of the deadliest wars of that period in 1675.
Wow.
And that war, King Philip's War in 1675. I mean, how would you estimate the casualties in a war like that? Was this especially devastating for the tribes?
Yeah, it is difficult to estimate, but I have read estimates of about 40% of the region's native people, not only Wampanoag, but others, including the Narragansett people, died. Many were sold into slavery in the Caribbean in the aftermath of that war. And then a substantial number of English people also were killed during King Philip's War. And I can't give you a figure right now, but I can pretty confidently say it's not as big as 40%.
Well, given some of that pretty terrible, horrifying history that happened after 1620, is it then true that the Thanksgiving holiday was kind of reinvented to create like a mythical good feeling between two peoples?
Well, I think it is true. I mean, yes, this is a memory that we all kind of have in common, as you guys described at the beginning of the show. And to some degree, it's invented, but it's. I don't want to go as far as to say it's fake, right? It's not fake. Something really did happen, which was, I think, really remarkable. That about 50 English men, women, and children had a 3-day feast with at least 90 Wampanoag men and perhaps Wampanoag women and children as well. And that was remarkable, that in spite of language barriers and some tensions, and some bad previous history, that the Wampanoag people really kind of took the English people under their protection in 1621, and they shared this meal. There are only two firsthand sources that really describe what happened, and one of them actually doesn't mention the presence of Wampanoag people at all. So there's really this one slender source, a long letter written by an Englishman named Edward Winslow, who kind of was the English ambassador to the Wampanoag people at that time, and he describes it really well, I think, or as well as we have a source. And so I think there is something worth studying and worth celebrating. It's definitely a moment of friendship between English and Wampanoag people.
Yeah. So my question is, moving forward a few hundred years now, so when did Black Friday become the day after Thanksgiving? Do you have any insight?
I'm going to plead ignorance. I'm an early Americanist, and
Okay.
I can pretty confidently say that Black Friday was not a thing before the Civil War, and after that, who knows?
I was thinking, maybe it's like a big trading day or something. I have no idea.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't think so.
Gabe, this idea though of the historical reckoning. So over the summer we've had statues in the South overturned, right? A reckoning with the Civil War. Do you see something similar eventually happening with this Thanksgiving story? I know that Plymouth Rock has been vandalized many times, sometimes with people who are upset with the story, other times just by kids who just seem to be random acts of vandalizing. But do you see a similar kind of reckoning eventually happening, and how should we feel about that?
That's a great question. I mean, I think the reason, as I understand it, that people, in particular Native people of different nations, would be upset with this story is what it leaves out, and what is not told in this story. And I think that is a big part of David Silverman's "This Land is Their Land." There's also a really nice and kind of short New Yorker article by Philip Deloria from last year called "The Invention of Thanksgiving," that makes reference to Silverman's book and a couple other really important books. And I think it's the left out part of the story that makes people so upset. That said, Wampanoag historians and cultural interpreters have really been telling a Wampanoag version of the Thanksgiving story for years. Ramona Peters, for example, is a Wampanoag historic preservation officer who has been willing to kind of publicly talk about this story and how to interpret it from a Wampanoag point of view. And so I wouldn't say that Thanksgiving is kind of universally condemned by Native people, and certainly not by Wampanoag people who are the descendants of the people who were there.
Well, how do this might be a question of historical method. How do professional historians determine which narratives become the so-called official narratives? Because what I've been upset about over the years is the fact that kids in middle school and high school, especially in the United States, get the story that is very much, it leaves, in my judgment, it leaves out way too much. How do the historians determine what becomes part of that official story?
That's a really good question, and it's different in different countries. I think the USA is a little bit more loosey-goosey maybe than some other countries about determining what the official story is. We do see, even as recently as this fall with President Trump and the 1619 Project, he kind of publicly critiqued it, argued that it shouldn't be something that schools teach. But I guess from my point of view, history is always an argument. We're always arguing over what the story is, what the truest story is, where to start the story, where to end the story, what to include. And that those arguments are often shaped by what we're worried about at this moment. So certainly this past summer and the Black Lives Matter movement is a big part of that, right? We're as a national community, our attention is more focused on issues of racial justice than in previous years, and that absolutely shapes the argument that we have. And go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, I've noticed. I used to teach down in South Carolina, and this was in the early '90s. And the textbooks, depending on where you live in this country, are different. So when they wanted me to teach social studies at a Sylvan Learning Center in South Carolina, and I wanted to look at the curriculum, and I couldn't teach it because it was not the history that I grew up with. And I had just done a pretty amazing paper on Thaddeus Stevens on the Reconstruction of the United States. And the chapter that they devoted to that, this is a McGraw-Hill textbook, was completely different than everything that I have ever learned up in Wisconsin. And so to your point, I think that it really depends on where you are for the version of history that you're going to get.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. State departments of education have some authority here, and certainly the state legislature dictates to some degree what you're going to get. But then how well you're going to get what the state legislature wants you to get is another question.
Right.
So, for example, Wisconsin has had a law that Wisconsin students have to learn Wisconsin Native history, but that doesn't always happen.
Right.
I think teachers really try. My own children's teachers, I think, have really gone far to doing this, but getting these rules even applied in the way that they're intended is tricky. And as you say, Matt, it's different from one state to another, sometimes from one school district to another.
Sure. Have you seen for your own kids' curriculum, have you seen things that you disagree with?
Oh, always. But I think I've become a little more tolerant of that. I realize that, people are trying. You can only really teach what you know. Yeah. And so it is on us, I think, on historians to really communicate what we know. And we have to let go to some degree and let the argument just continue, right? I mean, people with and without credentials are going to argue over what the right version is.
Sure. Yeah, and that's an important point, Gabe. You mentioned the 1620 project, which is I guess led by Nicole Hannah-Jones, a journalist for the New York Times. And basically the 1619 project tries to argue that essentially the history of the United States should begin in 1619 with the introduction of slavery into the North American continent. Yeah. My view has been that the 1619 project has been one of the most micromanaged pieces of history of all time, with, as I'm sure you are aware, a lot of professional, respected historians have said that there's a lot of inaccuracies in there. How much of that, though, is an issue of credentials? That the fact that the 1619 project is contributed to by lots of journalists, people that don't necessarily have master's and doctorate degrees in history.
Yeah, I think that's partly true, although, people with graduate degrees in history also argue vehemently about questions like this. And that's part of the process. I think, going back to the official version of history, I think what gets people most passionate about what we teach is not so much what an individual historian is saying, it's what are the school children going to hear?
Yes.
And so there's a lot of attempts to try to control that, and certainly the 1619 project is taught by K through 12 school teachers in some instances. And I think for me, what is most important, what I want students at the K through 12 and the college level to know is that there is no official history. We're constantly exploring this story. And while there is truth, I wouldn't go so far as some postmodernists who really question whether you can make any truth claim about the past. I absolutely think you can, And most histories are to some degree true. But our job is to really try to investigate and use the research skills that we have to figure out if we buy this story, or if we want a truer one, or if we can find a more true one. And so while I absolutely want students to come out of school knowing some certain things, I also think it's more important for them to have the confidence to be able to kind of look further into things and to know that the story is going to change.
Right. So it sounds like when you are teaching, say, the Thanksgiving narratives in any one of your classes, your goal for your students is that they will be able to contribute to that conversation.
Yeah, that's right. And Thanksgiving is an interesting one. In my classes at UW Oshkosh, I've heard many versions of the story. So often students are willing to say what they know, and many of them describe what you described. But then I think with students who are traditional college age, there are some new stories that they are learning in the K through 12 environment. Just last semester, one of my students said, I thought that the first Thanksgiving was actually a Thanksgiving for a massacre of Native people, which is interesting. And again, there is some truth to that, in that the 1621 event we've been talking about was not actually a Thanksgiving. It was a harvest feast. And there were Thanksgiving days called in the 1630s and 1670s for English and their native allies defeating the Pequot people and the Wampanoag people later on. So there is some truth to that, but it also, it creates a lot of confusion. Does that mean the 1621 event never happened? Was that a Thanksgiving for a massacre? And so you can get lost in some errors. And that's the other thing is, did it even happen? I'm convinced that it absolutely did. And if you guys are interested, at some point I could read the Edward Winslow version of what happened, which I think is a pretty true version as far as we can tell.
And it's very readily available on the on the web.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But some of the stories, and it sounds like your student was getting some of these stories about biological warfare starting around that time, right?
Yeah.
That the native population decimated by disease.
Yeah.
That there's evidence that the European settlers had brought over.
Right. Yeah, I think that's an important part of the backstory to the 1621 meal, is that Wampanoag people had suffered a serious population decline, probably as a result of smallpox or measles introduced by visiting transient English sailors, who, as far as I can tell, and as far as what I've read, in the 1620s, these English sailors did not know that they were bringing diseases that would become virgin epidemics to native people. By the 18th century, and in particular during and after the French and Indian War, there's evidence that English military officers did intentionally send smallpox-infected blankets to a nation that they were at war with. That doesn't seem to have been true for the 17th century, in which this story takes place.
Wasn't that General Amherst that
Correct.
was known for spreading smallpox?
He and some of his subordinate officers are the ones who discussed this.
Wow. This has been really fascinating. We have a few minutes left, and I want to make sure, Matt, that Gabe gets a chance to talk about what sounds like a really fascinating book coming out from you. You're going to be talking about welfare in George Washington's time.
Yeah.
And so just give us a kind of like a basic summary of your thesis in this book.
Thanks, Tony. I'd love to. Yeah, there is a long tradition of welfare in America, and this is something that I think is not widely known.
No.
A lot of People
No.
assume that welfare began in the 1930s with Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. And that's certainly when the term welfare began to be used more frequently. But for about 300 years before that, Americans in the US and before them, English people like the ones we're discussing who were at the harvest feast in 1621, they were all accustomed to government poor relief, which they usually called poor relief, which was mostly administered under the Elizabethan Poor Law. And essentially, every British American colony and then American state practiced more or less the Elizabethan Poor Law from independence until the New Deal.
Mhm.
How did you decide? You said you're studying 5 people.
Yeah.
Who were these 5 prominent people?
No, not really. Because the history of welfare in America is so little known, I thought it would be really important to write an accessible, fun to read book about it. And in my view, biography and microhistory are 2 really fun ways to get at the past. You know, you're following one person's life story and all the ups and downs, and it's both compelling and also gives you some helpful detail so that you're not lost in kind of the boring generalities that sometimes are necessary to write a big history of a subject like this.
Is one of your goals that if we can learn to appreciate the fact that welfare has been around since the beginning, that we would be less prone to scapegoat or demonize people that get welfare today?
I think that's fair. I don't think that I'm an expert on how welfare should be administered today, but I am concerned that when we talk about welfare, we tend to assume it's a very recent invention, and that there was a time in American history when people made do without welfare. And that's actually not true. There really was no such time. There was always a mixture of private charity, philanthropy, backed up by a pretty expensive and substantive system of government poor relief based on local taxes. I think the big distinction between welfare since the New Deal and what happened before is that before it was largely, almost entirely a local government operation. And in the New Deal, the federal government became much more involved.
When do you anticipate your book will be out?
Oh, it'll be in April, and it's full of good stories. There's one about an overseer of the poor named William Larned, who served in the Revolutionary War, and another one about a guy named Cuff Roberts, who William Larned banished from town repeatedly, who was also a Revolutionary War veteran. Another one about a nurse, a native woman called One-Eyed Sarah, who took care of poor patients at the government's expense. And then there's one about a woman named Lydia Bates, who was a recipient of poor relief in her small town, but lived with her neighbors. And then the last chapter is about another recipient of poor relief named William Fales, who lived in a poorhouse. And so the last 2 chapters compare and contrast the lives of these very different ways of receiving poor relief.
Well, so if you had to compare those stories to, do you think there would be 5 parallel stories for folks in today's world?
Yeah, I think you absolutely could. There are a lot of things that are quite similar. The system is different, but some of the themes are the same. How much or how little should we try to control people who are receiving poor relief? How much or how little poor relief should they receive? How should they receive it? All of these are things that early Americans struggled with too.
Wow.
Cool. Well, we are just about out of time. We want to thank Dr. Gabriel Loiacono. Gabe, this has been really fascinating.
Thank you guys for inviting me. It was really fun for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks
and
so
I think, in April, when your book does come out, we will have to have you back on.
That would be awesome.
To talk about it. All right, great. Let's do that. Have a great holiday.
All right.
Thanks
You
so much,
too.
Gabe. Happy Thanksgiving.
You too.
Take care.
Bye, Matt. Bye, Tony.
Bye-bye. Tony, that was a really cool interview, and I'm glad we talked about maybe not doing an interview or even a show this week, but with the timing of Thanksgiving, and I mean that was enlightening.
Yeah, I think so. And so much of the conversation this week in 2020 has been about warning people not to visit their family for Thanksgiving, and I like the idea that we're contributing some sense of how to even think about Thanksgiving outside the pandemic, right?
Yeah.
What are we celebrating in the first place? And I thought that Dr. Loiacono did a really wonderful job of showing us how there's some truth to those old stories we were told. But I love that he focused on there's a lot missing in the story.
Yeah. What I hope is that, like in his classes, and even for folks listening to this, that it is a version of the truth. We know that there's a lot of true things, and probably a lot of things we don't even know, and definitely some things that aren't true. But I hope it inspires people. Like I could see somebody in his class going, you know what, this is what we believe is the truth, but I'm going to dive into this. So I'm hoping that it encourages some free thinkers to go out and check out and see what's really out there, because you'll be amazed at what you find.
Absolutely. So yeah, we'll definitely have him on again when his book comes out.
Absolutely.
Welfare in George Washington's Time. I can't wait to hear about that.
I think that's fascinating. I mean, I know this is a lot of academia and geek speak or whatever, but for me, this is fascinating stuff. And especially in a time of a pandemic, which is not gone yet, I definitely need some brain food. So I appreciate this.
All right. Well, let's wish everybody a happy Thanksgiving and thank everyone for listening to Running on MT.
Yeah. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody. And we're working on some ideas for some future shows. So thank you so much for tuning in. Stay safe, stay elevated, and we'll see you next time.
You're running on empty with Matt and Tony.